It gives me great pleasure to welcome and introduce Martin Edwards. Educated in Northwich and at Oxford University, where he received a first-class degree in law, Martin is the undisputed expert and authority on the golden age of detective fiction. A prolific writer of crime fiction himself, his list of achievements and awards is long and impressive, and to name but a few, Martin is the winner of the Crime Writers Association Diamond Dagger Award, the highest honour in British crime writing. He has also received the CWA's Dagger in the Library Award, which is awarded by UK librarians for his body of work. And in addition to this, he was chair of the CWA for 2 years. In 2015, Martin was elected as the 8th president of the Detection Club. He edited How Done It, produced by the club, which includes tips and insights into the craft of crime writing from some 90 authors. How Done It has been nominated for 2 awards in the UK and 3 in the US. He is a member of Murder Squad, a collective of crime writers, which includes Anne Cleeves and Margaret Murphy. His most recent books are Gallows Court and Mortmain Hall, set in the Golden Age. Gallows Court has been described as dark, stylish, ingenious, and pacey, and Mortmain Hall, a classic whodunit with the author impressively channeling Agatha Christie. Martin has appeared several times at the Lytton Phil, and I'm delighted that he has agreed to talk to me this evening about his favourite topic, the golden age of crime writing. Welcome, Martin.
Thanks very much, Kay, and hello everyone. I wish I could be with you in person, but I'm with you in spirit, and it's great to have the opportunity to join you from Cheshire, which is where I live.
Martin, can I just start by asking you, when exactly was the golden age of crime writing?
Well, it's one of those terms, I think, Kay, where it's sort of kind of vague and ambiguous term. One of those things where everyone knows what you mean by the golden age, but precise definitions vary. But for me, the golden age of detective fiction was the period between the 2 world wars. There are reasons why I say that. I think that is really the time when the innovation in golden age fiction took place. Of course, what happened after the Second World War was that some writers like Agatha Christie, who's a pillar of golden age fiction, continued writing, and she and a few others continued writing for many years. But they weren't necessarily doing anything brand new in comparison to the innovations that they were responsible for in the 20s and the 1930s. People continued and continue to this day to write books in the style of the golden age, and they use the tropes of golden age detective fiction, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. And there's no doubt that in the last few years, there's been a huge revival of interest in golden age detective fiction. And that has not only involved readers rediscovering golden age books from the past, but also contemporary writers working in that vein in a whole variety of ways. So it's a tradition that lives on, but the golden age itself, I think, was really the period between the 2 wars.
Right. So what was the catalyst, in fact, for the golden age, do you think?
Well, I think that in fiction, in literature, as in life, wars change things. And what happened with the First World War, and then, of course, a global pandemic in the immediate aftermath of the war, the Spanish flu, so-called, was that there was a period of great worldwide trauma. And certainly in Britain, as well as in many other places, really everybody was touched by that trauma in some way. There were a colossal number of casualties, terrible slaughter on the Western Front, and even the people who stayed at home, they lost loved ones, or loved ones were wounded or suffered very severe, what used to be called shell shock, we now call it PTSD. So it had a huge impact. And then the Spanish flu killed even more people. So it was a terrible time and a very agonizing time for many, many millions of people in Britain and elsewhere. And when the war was over and when the pandemic was under control, there was a reaction to it. People wanted fun. They'd gone through a terrible time and they wanted to enjoy themselves. And this is what sparked the Roaring Twenties, the era of the flapper and all that kind of thing. And it was a period when games were very popular. Play fever was a term that was often used at that time. Games like mahjong, contract bridge, the solving of crossword puzzles. These were hugely popular pastimes. People just wanted entertainment. The Jazz Age. So I think that crime fiction was a part of that. There was a reaction amongst crime writers and crime readers, and it was led by a new generation of writers, people like Agatha Christie, Dorothy L. Sayers, Anthony Barclay, people who had lived through the war but were still young and turned after the war to writing detective stories. But they wanted to have fun, and they were keen on the idea of the detective story as a puzzle, a game really between the reader and the writer. Can you solve the mystery before the great detective reveals all in the library or wherever it might be at the end of the book? And that kind of story suddenly became hugely popular. And it was rather different from what had happened in detective fiction before then. If we think of somebody like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of the immortal Sherlock Holmes, he was hugely influential and a great innovator. And he was someone who was very explicit about his desire to play fair with the reader. But what he meant by that was that he wanted the solution to the mystery in the detective story not to come out of nowhere. It had to be explained through logical reasoning. And so the Sherlock Holmes stories, we have Sherlock making his marvelous and extraordinarily impressive, if sometimes improbable, deductions, and he tells us what the evidence is, and so we understand how he arrives at his conclusion. But the Golden Age writers took the idea of playing fair with the reader a stage further. In the Sherlock Holmes stories, we're not competing with Sherlock. We're just dazzled by his brilliance, that the clues aren't there for us to see and observe and interpret. Conan Doyle isn't writing that sort of short story. And indeed, he's predominantly writing short stories. There are 4 novels, but really only one of them, The Hound of the Baskervilles, is a truly great detective novel. The rest are not amongst his best works, I think. But with the young writers who emerged after the First World War, the likes of Christie, Sayers, and so on, they tended to prefer writing novels, and they used that additional length, the space of a novel, to hide the clues in plain sight, to put them in the text so that the reader had the chance of solving the puzzle, but then to misdirect the reader in a whole range of ways. This was something Christie was particularly good at. And so the reader doesn't necessarily understand the significance of the clues that are in the text. So it was a game, but it was a game that was played quite cunningly by the better writers, at least. And the idea of playing fair with the reader became really important, and it took the form of putting all the clues in there so that you had a fair chance to beat the great detective to it. But of course, most of Christie's readers didn't manage to beat Hercule Poirot to the eventual solution.
Are there any other typical features of Golden Age writing, would you say?
Oh, I think so. I think that there are quite a number of tropes which helped to add to the idea of mystification, and this idea of although the clues are in the text, we're going to put all this miasma in the story so you don't necessarily pick them up. So one idea that was popular with a lot of writers and remains quite popular with writers today is the idea of the dying message clue. So somebody's dying and their final words gives some sort of cryptic clue to the solution of the mystery. The American writer Ellery Queen specialised in that kind of mystery, but Agatha Christie was amongst those who used it. There's a book called Why Didn't They Ask Evans, where that cryptic question really conveys the heart of the solution to the mystery. But of course, understanding it is rather difficult from the reader's point of view. But it is a fair clue in the circumstance of the book. So the dying message clue was one thing. It didn't originate in the Golden Age, but it became hugely popular. And the same thing was true of the locked room mystery, this idea of the locked room or the impossible crime, where there's a paradox. A crime is committed, somebody's murdered, but the room is locked, the windows are barred, the doors shut, there's no way in from beneath or above. So how did it happen? And there are all kinds of variations of that. So a body found in a pavilion in the grounds of a country house, which is surrounded by unmarked snow. How did the murderer actually commit the crime? And this idea of the impossible crime wasn't new to the Golden Age, but it became a major feature of Golden Age fiction, particularly with American writers like John Dickson Carr, who was a great exponent of the locked room mystery. But Agatha Christie, again, wrote a number of impossible crime stories. Hercule Poirot's Christmas is probably the best example. So there are quite methods and tropes that featured in Golden Age fiction. And it was all, I think, a way of trying to mystify and provoke the curiosity of the reader, whilst putting those clues in the story, so that you were able to solve it if you could. And some writers, both in Britain and in the States, actually formalized this challenge. There was a point in the book, a formal challenge to the reader. You get near the end, and then before you turn the page, there's a page that says, you've now got all the clues, can you answer the following questions? So that formal challenge to the reader was quite a popular device. And there was another device called the Clue Finder, which was introduced in the late 1920s and was popular for quite a number of years. And that was really a way of the author demonstrating that they'd played fair with the reader. Right at the end of the story, there are references back, either by footnotes or in a table at the end, to the clues that have appeared in the text. So the writer is in effect saying, there you are, it was there in front of you. Did you actually pick those clues up? So all these tropes were really part of the game of detective fiction and really became very, very popular, particularly in the 1920s.
Thank you. How did detective fiction evolve during the Golden Age, do you think?
Well, nothing, of course, stays the same forever. And even within the period I've described as the Golden Age, between the two world wars, you do see an evolution. In the late 1920s, people like Dorothy L. Sayers, creator of Lord Peter Wimsey, were asking the question, are we going to run out of ideas? Is detective fiction going to come to a full stop? Well, it hasn't done, but that was a question that was certainly being asked in the 20s. Have we run out of tricks in effect? So there was a feeling by the end of the 20s that the story, the detective story, had to do something more than just be a puzzle. And a number of writers became increasingly interested in the idea of developing the detective novel as a literary form, and writing quality fiction in the form of a detective story. Dorothy L. Sayers was in the vanguard of that movement. So was Anthony Berkeley. His full name was Anthony Berkeley Cox. He was very prominent. And in Britain, Berkeley founded the Detection Club, which you mentioned in the introduction, Kay. And the Detection Club was and remains a small social network, a dining club, essentially, a small group of crime writers. Of course, in 1930, which is when the club was founded, crime writers didn't generally know each other. You know, there was no social media, there's no blogosphere, no Facebook, no Twitter. How did people survive? You wonder, but they did survive, but they didn't know each other. And the Detection Club was a way of connecting a small group of writers. So Berkeley, Christie, Sayers, Father Arnold Knox, G.K. Chesterton, A.A. Milne, the creator of Winnie the Pooh, who wrote a little bit of detective fiction, H.C. Bailey, J.J. Connington, the scientist, who wrote very sophisticated fair play detective stories, R. Austin Freeman, another scientist who wrote very elaborate scientific puzzles. And the Detection Club became very influential, both in terms of the books that they started to produce together in the 1930s. I've got a copy here of the first edition of The Floating Admiral, which was published in 1931, shortly after the club was formed. And this was a round-robin novel where one person writes first chapter and another person takes the story on. And Christie and Sayers contributed chapters to that book. And Anthony Berkeley wrote a very long chapter at the end, trying to tie up all the innumerable loose ends. And that was a hugely successful book, still in print to this very day. And again, it was about playing a game in one way, but by now these writers were trying to write something of genuine literary quality. It didn't always succeed, of course, but it became increasingly important to them. And furthermore, the world had changed. The Roaring Twenties had come to an end with the Wall Street crash. So it certainly come to an end with a big bad bang. And life in the 30s became very difficult. You had the slump, unemployment, the depression in the States, and people still loved detective stories, and still read them in large number. But increasingly, as the world again became a darker place, you had the rise of the dictators. So you had Benito Mussolini in Italy, you had Hitler coming to the fore in Germany. And these tensions start to reflect indirectly in some of the books of the Golden Age. And one of the things that's been very interesting to me in the last 20 years or so is identifying the many books in which there's a subtext. And it's a subtext which I tend to sum up as being all to do with the idea of the altruistic crime. The conventional idea of the detective story, of course, is that the murder is a terrible crime and it's a sin, and it needs to be solved. But a bit of ambiguity began to creep in, because writers, as with many people in society at large, started to ask themselves, what happens if the legal system that we rely on to apply the criminal law, what if that system isn't working? What if there are miscarriages of justice? What if the system is corrupt? What if it's manipulated by a dictator? Might there be circumstances where the crime of murder is actually not such an obviously terrible thing after all? And I don't want to spoil any any stories that any of you might not have read, and I'll try very hard to avoid that. But I'll give you a couple of striking examples, maybe the most famous examples of the point that I'm trying to make. If we take Agatha Christie, one of her most famous classic detective novels, an Hercule Poirot mystery, is The Murder on the Orient Express. Very clever detective story, very famous, colossally successful, from when it was published in the mid-30s to the present day. Filmed, televised, radio versions, a huge commercial success. But if you think about that detective story, which is in many ways a piece of light commercial entertainment, of course, that's what it is, first and foremost. What's it really about? Well, I think it's about trying to answer the question, how achieve justice in a society where the system does not achieve justice? That, to me, is the question which is really at the root of Murder on the Orient Express. It's not in the foreground because Christie was a very wise woman as well as a great writer, and she didn't like to preach. Good example as a writer, I think. She wasn't didactic, but she had her views and her attitudes. Of course she did. And that question is right there at the heart of that novel. And another novel, about 4 years later, may be the greatest golden age detective novel of all time, and indeed my personal favourite. And Then There Were None, this story about 10 people who are marooned on this little island off the Devon coast, and one by one they're murdered. An extraordinary novel by any standards, and astonishingly successful film, TV. I think it's the best-selling detective novel of all time, and for good reason. It is, in its own particular way, a genuine masterpiece, I would argue. But again, if you look beyond the clever mystery, what is that story really about? Again, it's about how do we achieve justice when society lets us down, when the system doesn't work. And I think that these were concerns that were bothering people in one way or another, and they were bothering writers and readers through the 1930s. And you see these issues actually reflected in the detective fiction of the 1930s, as well as a greatly increased focus on the psychology of crime through the 1930s. So the golden age detective novel is developing. It's still first and foremost a puzzle, but there's more to it than meets the eye, and there's more to it than many of the critics have I think, recognised over the years.
Thank you. So what brought the golden age to an end, and did people continue to write in that style?
Well, as I said earlier, I think wars do change everything, and the Second World War, again, came along and changed life across the world. And it had a different effect, because here was a global conflict of a different kind. And there were stories emerging as people learned about what was going on in places like Auschwitz and in Dagger, the Holocaust, all the horrors there, and all the horrors in the Far East. And also the bomb, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. You know, a scientist can create a weapon that can wipe out vast numbers of society. The world has changed in quite a dramatic way. And people are becoming increasingly conscious across the world of what evil acts a human being is really capable of. We've seen it with Hitler, with Mussolini, and all the rest of them. These cruel tyrants, and then the people who carry out their bidding. And this, I think, brought a huge change in society as a whole. And again, fiction reflects society, and detective fiction, crime fiction, reflects society. And so I think what happened was that although some writers, as I mentioned, like Christie and Ngaio Marsh and Gladys Mitchell and others, continued to write and wrote for many years after the Second World War, others stopped. Dorothy L. Sayers stopped, Anthony Berkeley stopped, and quite a few others stopped because they felt that they could no longer adapt their fiction to the new way of life that they saw developing around them. And I think that in particular, critical attention switched away from the puzzle kind of detective story. It was seen as old-fashioned, as passé, it belonged to the past. And the new thing was the novel of character, the novel of psychology, and you had writers emerging, people in the United States, such as Patricia Highsmith, a brilliant writer of psychological suspense who wasn't in any way a whodunit writer. She did write one whodunit, and it was one of her weakest books, as she herself admitted. So interest shifted on the part of writers, readers, critics. There was still a big readership for Christie above all, and others, but it wasn't as fashionable as it had been in the 20s and 30s. The mood had changed, and the new generation of writers, because Christie had been young, Berkeley and Sayers had been young in the 20s, the new generation of writers, the people who were the equivalents, like Julian Simmons in Britain, and Shelley Smith, Margot Bennett, a very fine Scottish crime novelist, and then Patricia Highsmith in the States, Margaret Miller, Canadian writer of great distinction. They were writers with different priorities. Many of them could produce an excellent plot when they were inclined to do so, but that for them was far from being the be-all and end-all. They were interested in what was happening in society. It was more overt, that interest, than it had been in the 30s, and they were interested in exploring character and the nature of evil, the psychology of evil. And there's a huge wave of psychiatrist detectives and stories of that kind. Margaret Miller started with books of that kind. So it was more than a change of emphasis. I think it was a sea change in the way that writers wanted to write, and the preoccupations that guided what they wrote about.
So tell us about what sparked your own golden age crime writing.
Sorry, Kay, could you repeat that, please?
Could you tell us what actually sparked your own love of golden age crime writing?
Well, in my case, it began when I was a small boy with Agatha Christie. I came across Agatha when I was 8. I saw the film Murder Most Foul as a small boy, a memorable occasion, and went home and picked off the bookshelf at home a paperback of The Murder at the Vicarage, and I was hooked. And I was hooked in 2 different ways. I was hooked, first of all, as a fan. And I'm still very much a fan of detective fiction, crime fiction, all kinds of crime fiction. But also, I had that urge, even from that tender age, to write detective stories. And yeah, I started at a young age writing my own little detective stories. So I still have my early efforts in a very, very surprisingly neat handwriting at the age of 10. So it really goes back a very long way, but it became a fixation almost, an addiction in a way, of a benign kind, I like to think, that has stayed with me all the way through to today. And it's enriched my life in an extraordinary manner. I'm enormously grateful to crime fiction. I wouldn't be with you all today if it were not for that early initiation with Agatha and Miss Marple. So I'm very grateful, even though in many ways I've moved on. I remain admiring of what Agatha Christie achieved.
The British Library's crime classics have played a part in the revival of Golden Age fiction. How did this project come about?
Well, what happened with the British Library, Kay, is this. They had the idea. They had a very tiny publications team, and they brought out a few books. But of course, libraries, as we all know, need more revenue and need the support that revenue brings. And so they felt they might publish a few detective stories. And so they began with three old landmark Victorian detective stories that they published, very interesting books, but didn't do very much commercially. And then they decided to try the Golden Age. And they brought out a couple of books by a very obscure writer called Mavis Doriel Hay. And at around this time, I was down in London, and I was copied into some emails involving the British Library, the guy at the British Library, Rob Davis. And I happened to be working down in London, but I had a spare couple of hours. So I actually dropped Rob Davis a line and said, if you're free for a cup of coffee, maybe we could have a chat, because I was very interested in what he was doing. So I went over to meet him. We had a cup of coffee together, got on well. And he told me that what the library was planning to do was to issue more books. They had, by this time, 3 on the stocks by Mavis Doriel Hay. But they wanted to try something different. They decided to use different artwork on the covers of the paperbacks. They're all paperbacks. And they thought they would use vintage railway poster artwork. And so Rob said to me, we're bringing out a couple of books by a writer called John Bude, again, very obscure, The Cornish Coast Murder and The Lake District Murder. Would you like to write a couple of introductions for them? So I agreed, wrote the introductions, really thought no more about it. And then I got a very excited message from Rob saying that the orders for the books had suddenly taken off. And those books suddenly sold in tens of thousands, far more than the original editions had ever done. It was quite astonishing that none of us anticipated. I'd like to think it was the learned and erudite introductions, but I think certainly the covers were very appealing. They appealed to shops like Waterstones, who've been very supportive of the series, and the element of nostalgia, I think, played a part. But readers rediscovered these books, and so more and more books came out. I wrote more and more introductions. I was asked to become the consultant to the series, and still am. And it's now, I don't know, 80 or 90 books have been published. They've been publishing a book a month for all that time. And it's been absolutely extraordinary. Even in this country alone, in paperback, they've sold over 1 million copies, not counting ebooks. They've sold extraordinarily well, not just in the States, but in other countries you might not expect, like India, China. There's a huge amount of interest in Golden Age detective fiction in China, massive interest. And I went over to Shanghai a couple of years ago, and I was signing copies of the British Library anthologies I've edited. It was quite extraordinary and hard to credit, really, because it began with that cup of coffee with a young editor who just had a very good idea and was very perceptive.
What do you think the reason is for that revival of interest in this type of writing, Martin? And do you think that contemporary writers are still being influenced by Golden Age fiction?
I think so. What has happened in the last few years is to me quite extraordinary and also quite wonderful because, as I've mentioned, I've been fascinated by this type of writing since I was a small boy. And when I wrote my first series of books set in Liverpool in the 1990s, Harry Devlin books, my idea was to combine a sort of gritty, contemporary, modern, quite down market setting with golden age type plots, and I wrote 7 books, and then later on an 8th book in that series. They did well, but they were critically well received, except that nobody ever mentioned the golden age plots. It was all about the gritty Liverpool background, character, that sort of thing. That was really a bit disappointing to me because I put a lot of work into those plots and the golden age references and all that kind of thing. But it really, I think, illustrates how deeply unfashionable golden age fiction was at that time. But if you live long enough, fashion comes round, the wheel turns around. And so I think in recent years, there's been a rediscovery of these books. Obviously, digital publishing has made it possible to reprint books much more cheaply. Until a few years ago, a book went out of print, and generally, unless it was by Agatha Christie or another big name, it stayed out of print. And some of these books, the British Library has reissued, been out of print for 60, 70, 80 years, a very long time. But once they are available again and they're nicely presented, nice covers, and they're wonderful introductions, I never forget those, and they're displayed in Waterstones, people pick them up and give them as presents, and people read them. Well, actually, these are pretty good stories. And so people have rediscovered all kinds of authors. E.C.R. Lorac, I've mentioned John Bude, but all kinds of people who've been out of print for 50 years plus have suddenly come back. And they've come back, they've sold more than they sold in their lifetimes, and they are being genuinely enjoyed by a new generation of readers who are finding something in these books, both because the stories are entertaining and now they're social documents. They tell us something about the life and times of people in the days when the books were written. It's social history. It's not consciously done by the authors. The authors are mainly aiming just to tell a story and not to tell much more than that. That's true of Lorac and quite a few of the others. But now those books tell us something about those times in a way that is very hard to find elsewhere, certainly in conventional history books. So there's an added layer of appeal, I think, to these older books now, which is quite fascinating, and I would say long overdue.
And do you think this revival will be sustained? You certainly hope so.
I definitely hope so. I think that the wheel of fashion will continue to turn. That is absolutely inevitable. But what I've been keen to encourage the British Library to do is to have a very eclectic range of books. So you don't just have Bude and Lorac, you have writers like Mary Kelly, Gil North, the Yorkshire writer. You have Julian Simmons, Michael Gilbert, writers of a later period who were writing very different books. Margot Bennett, the Scottish writer I mentioned earlier, as well as John Dixon Carr and the Locked Room Stories and all of those. So you see the range of books. I think this is important to showcase the sheer variety of crime fiction. Crime fiction today is incredibly diverse, and that's a very good thing. It's often thought that the crime fiction of the past was not, but it was. And this series, I think, illustrates that truth. So there is a lot of variety. I think that if you want a cozy, conventional detective type story, some of the books in the series won't appeal to you. But that doesn't seem to me to be a problem, because I think the existence of a range of books that appeals to a wide variety of tastes and bringing back good stories is a worthwhile endeavor in itself. And now that technology permits this, at least books shouldn't go out of print in the way that they used to. So I think that although some writers may have their moment in the sun, and then it dips somewhat in sales terms and in terms of public attention, I think at least the books will still be readily available because of the technology and the economics of publishing changing so much from the past. In the past, when you needed to print a certain number of copies to justify printing any copy, those days have gone now. With print on demand and ebooks and all that kind of thing. So I think that there is a permanent change in the landscape in terms of availability, and that to me again is a great blessing. The fact that more books are available. So as a writer, I don't like the idea of books not being available, but now more and more books are available, and that I think has to be good.
I was going to ask you, as we emerge from COVID, do you think this presents new challenges to the crime writer in any way? Or we still don't know? Well,
the short-term challenge is do I mention COVID and the pandemic in my book or not? The book I've got coming out in July is Lake District Mystery, Crooked Shore. And that one was written mainly before the pandemic. And I took a decision during the pandemic to shift the time when the events take place very, very slightly, so that it's all in effect in 2019, so pre-pandemic, because the pandemic would just have got in the way of the story. Plus, at the moment, I really don't want to write about the pandemic. The day will come, I'm sure, but I think it is slightly reminiscent of the post-First World War and post-Spanish flu pandemic situation. It took about 10 years in that case for people to want to start writing about the war. It's really 1928 is often picked on as the year when people started writing about the war. There's a famous play called Journey's End. In detective fiction, Sayers wrote The Unpleasantness at the Bologna Club, which heavily references the war. And things changed from that point. But there was a time when people just wanted to get away from the thought of war. And I think that certainly in my case, and probably in the case of many other people, at the moment, the last thing you want to read about or write about is the pandemic. I'm quite sure that a lot of people will have been using the time in the pandemic writing novels about the pandemic, but who knows how many of those will see the light of day. At the moment, it's not something I want to write about or read about. I think about it as little as possible, if I'm perfectly honest. But there will come a time when hopefully we survive and we're through all of this, when we look back and that will be a different situation then, and that will be the time to reflect, and no doubt to write about it and read about it. But for me, at the moment, it's far too soon.
I have a question from who asks, what was your favourite discovery in the BL collection?
Oh, that's an interesting question, because discovery implies a book that I wasn't familiar with. A sort of discovery was the Gil North books set in Yorkshire in the 1960s, Sergeant Clough. I was aware of them, but I'd not actually read them. And Clough was often described as the Yorkshire Maigret, and I thought those are pretty dour, brooding books, but I thought those were pretty interesting. I've read more Mary Kelly as a result of the Crime Classics series. I'd read The Spoilt Kill, which won the Gold Dagger in 1961, and that's been reprinted. That's her masterpiece, but I've read more of her books. I think she's a very interesting writer. I've rediscovered some of the Julian Simmons books that I read as a teenager, which I enjoyed. He's a writer I admire, as is Michael Gilbert. And there have been other writers. Anthony Gilbert, I've read more of hers, because Anthony Gilbert was a she. And the early John Dickson Carrs, I'm a big fan of John Dickson Carr, but I'd not read his earliest books involving the French detective Henri Bencoin. And those first 4 books have been reprinted in the series. And so those are an interesting discovery to go back right to the beginning of his career. When he was a young man, he was in his 20s. He was actually elected to the Detection Club when he was 30, very, very young. But he'd already written 10 or more very successful detective novels. So those are some of my favourite discoveries that spring to mind.
Another question for you. Modern detectives seem to have real personal difficulties or problems, e.g. rebus. Was this much of a feature in Golden Age detectives?
No. I think that what happened within the Golden Age was that there was a massive change in the way that detectives are portrayed. If you think back to Sherlock Holmes, then by and large, he is essentially the same character from when he first appears in the 1880s to his final appearance 40 years later, 27. He's a brilliant character, but he doesn't grow as a person to any significant extent. And the same is true of Hercule Poirot. Of course, the TV versions, the John Malkovich version, for example, those are done in a different way. But in the books, Poirot does not develop at all as a character. Miss Marple, really the same. But Sayers was the one who changed things enormously, because she created Lord Peter Wimsey essentially as a piece of wish fulfillment when she was very poor and despondent and an unmarried mother, and creating him was a pure act of escapism, often deemed to be snobbish, but that wasn't her motivation, in my opinion. I think it's an act of pure escapism, pure and simple. However, because, as I mentioned earlier, she was a very ambitious writer with considerable literary gifts, she realized that she wanted to develop him as a character. So, having previously frowned and looked askance at love interest in detective stories, she criticized Austin Freeman for the love interest in his scientific stories. She actually introduces in 1930, seminal year in the genre's development, in Strong Poison, she introduces Harriet Vane, who's on trial for murder. Wimsey sees her, falls in love with her, determined to clear her name, solve the mystery, and he sets out to marry her, and she resists, and that on-off relationship develops over a number of books during the 1930s before they finally get married in the late 30s. And this was the first example of a detective character, serious detectives really developing and having relationships that ebbed and flowed. Of course, that now happens all the time. It's very uncommon indeed to have a stereotypical great detective who has no personality. And what you have with the likes of Rebus is a detective who, in some respects, these are very well written and very well plotted books, the Rebus books, very, very good, top level crime fiction by any standards at any period of history, I would say. What you have is a character who has his demons, Um, but we empathise with him as a character, and he's grown steadily and he's aged over the years that Ian Rankin has been writing about him. Of course, the idea of the police officer with a troubled personal life and a drink problem and that kind of thing, it can become a cliche. And yeah, how many stories have we seen where the cop is suspended by an unthinking senior officer, but goes out and solves the mystery anyway? That crops up time and time again, and it is a bit of a cliche, although it can be well done in some cases. But the leading writers such as Ian Rankin will use these tropes and make something fresh with them, I think, and that's really what identifies such authors as leaders in the field.
Was Golden Age in languages other than English?
Sorry, Kay, you're breaking up twice. I didn't quite hear that.
Was Golden Age detective fiction written in languages other than English?
It absolutely was. And one of the great myths is that the Golden Age detective story was a purely British or English even invention. Far, far, far from the truth. There was a very vibrant Golden Age tradition in the United States, Ellery Queen, S.S. Van Dyne, and many, many more. They were hugely popular. They were superseded by the private eye writers, the hardboiled writers such as Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler, James M. Cain, and many more. But there were a lot of books of that kind written in the States, and they were hugely successful at the time. But they were also being written in France, Germany, Italy, Japan, places you wouldn't expect. In India, Bengal, was the Bengali detective stories. I edited an anthology for the British Library called Foreign Bodies, which was essentially classic crime stories, although not just in the Golden Age, but classic crime stories from all kinds of unlikely places, ranging from South America to the Far East, and it simply isn't the case that it was a purely British phenomenon. Of course, a lot of these stories were not translated, so people weren't aware of them. And now they are being translated. There's a very good small press called Locked Room International, which has translated a lot of French and Italian locked room mysteries from the Golden Age that people in this country were basically unaware of. But in their day in those countries, they were quite successful. So it was much more of an international phenomenon than people have recognized. And now, at long last, those books again are being made available because of the changes in technology that I talked about earlier. And so we're able to see what was going on in quite a wide variety of different countries.
Maybe just a final question now, Martin. We have one from somebody who's studying crime fiction at UEA, and he asked, do you agree with professionalization of an academic approach to learning to write crime fiction?
I'm certainly not against it. That's the first thing. I've conducted plenty of workshops myself. I've not so much done academic courses, but I definitely wouldn't rule it out in the future. I'm interested in encouraging aspiring writers, and I think that encouraging them is a very, very good thing to do. I'm a big believer in it. Whether the courses are successful or not depends, like anything else, on the quality. I'm not very familiar with the East Anglia course, but I believe it's a very, very good one. Everything I know about it sounds very positive. I'm very, very interested indeed in the link between academic commentary on crime fiction and general reviewing of crime fiction and discussion of crime fiction. I think at the moment, and certainly in the recent past, there's been a huge explosion of interest in academia, in crime fiction that wasn't there 30 or 40 years ago. But the books that are being produced, I judge them to some extent on the quality of the writing, and I'm keen to develop conversations between academics, because I think that sometimes you can think of one or two books where the footnotes and the bibliographies seem more important than the quality of the writing. And I think that whatever you're doing in the literary world, it ultimately comes down to the quality of writing. You write the best that you can, and I'm keen to see the academic material becoming increasingly accessible, more readily available, published more affordably, because there are some brilliant academics. I know a number of them working today in the crime field, coming up with fresh ideas about current writing and writing of the past. I think that's a great thing and to be encouraged. So I think the more there is a meeting of these disciplines, the academic discipline and the commercial writing discipline, I think the better.
Well, I think on that note, we could close tonight's event, but I'd like to thank you so much on behalf of everybody here and Little Phil for taking time to talk to us so eloquently. The love of your subject comes shining through, so it's much appreciated. Thank you, and I hope it's not too long before we can see each other in the Little Phil itself. Thank you very much, Martin.
That will be wonderful, Kay. I really look forward to it. Thank you all for sparing the time to listen to me talking, as Kay says, about the love of my life in literary terms, at least.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Good night.